You faced the shadow. You did the work. You healed the wounds. And now, you feel empty. No drive, no spark, no motivation left. The worst part? You can't explain why. You should feel better, but instead you're wondering if you broke something inside yourself. What if this isn't a failure? What if this silence is actually a sign your soul just stopped performing? There's something nobody tells you about shadow work. Something Carl Jung knew but rarely spoke about directly. When you finish excavating your unconscious, when you've pulled up all the buried shame and unmet needs and childhood wounds, you don't just feel better. You feel different. Fundamentally, unsettlingly different. Jung once wrote, "The collapse of the persona is often mistaken for depression." He understood something most modern psychology misses entirely. When you've done deep inner work, when you've faced your shadow and integrated those rejected parts of yourself, your entire motivational system doesn't just shift, it disintegrates. And that disintegration isn't pathology. It's transformation. Think about it. For years, maybe decades, you were motivated by unconscious forces. The need to be loved, the fear of abandonment, the drive to prove your worth, the terror of not being enough. These weren't conscious choices. They were survival mechanisms running in the background, pushing you forward, keeping you busy, making you productive. But shadow work doesn't just heal these wounds, it exposes the entire machinery. Suddenly, you can see how much of your life was driven by fear, wearing the mask of ambition. How much of your motivation was actually just avoiding pain dressed up as pursuing pleasure. When that machinery stops working, when those unconscious drivers are no longer driving you, you don't just lose motivation. You lose the only reasons you've ever had to be motivated. This is what Jung called the necessary dissolution before rebirth. But nobody prepares you for how quiet it feels in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's not her real name, but her story is completely real. Sarah spent 2 years in intensive therapy after a devastating breakup revealed patterns she'd been carrying since childhood. She did the work. EMDR, inner child, healing, parts work, shadow integration. She faced everything. By the end of those 2 years, she was genuinely healed. The anxiety that had driven her for decades was gone. The need to please everyone had dissolved. The fear of being alone had transformed into genuine self-companionship. But when she tried to return to her career in marketing, something felt wrong. Not bad wrong, just empty. The campaigns that used to excite her felt meaningless. The client meetings that once energized her left her feeling hollow. The promotions she'd been chasing for years suddenly seemed like elaborate distractions from something she couldn't name. "I used to wake up every morning with a fire in my belly," she told me. "Even if it was anxiety, even if it was fear, it was fuel. Now I wake up and feel nothing. Like I'm waiting for instructions from a voice that isn't speaking." This is what Jung called the nigredo phase of psychological alchemy, the necessary darkness, the void, the dissolution that must happen before new life can emerge. In medieval alchemy, nigredo was the blackening, the death of the old form before any transformation could begin. But here's what makes this so confusing in our culture. We've been taught that healing should feel good, that growth should be linear, that progress should be measurable. We expect shadow work to work like taking medicine. You feel sick, you take the pill, you feel better. Instead, shadow work often works like surgery. The procedure is successful, but the recovery is long, strange, and nothing like what you expected. During our cake, this phase, you might find yourself unable to care about things that used to matter deeply. Career goals that once seemed vital, now feel arbitrary. Relationships that once excited you might feel performative. Hobbies that used to bring joy might feel forced. This isn't depression in the clinical sense. You're not hopeless or worthless. You're not unable to function. You're just not motivated by the same things anymore. And without those familiar carrots and sticks, you don't know how to move forward. Jung understood this as a sign that your psyche is undergoing a fundamental reorganization. The ego, your sense of separate self, is no longer in the driver's seat, but the self, your deeper, more authentic essence, hasn't fully emerged yet. You're in the in-between space, the liminal realm, the void that exists between one way of being and another. Pause here and take a breath. Is this what you've been carrying all along? This sense that you should feel more motivated, more driven, more alive than you do? The truth is, your psyche is protecting you from going backward. It's refusing to let you re-engage with motivations that were never truly yours to begin with. But it hasn't yet revealed what will motivate you moving forward. This isn't laziness. This isn't failure. This isn't even stagnation. This is your soul taking a sacred pause before the next phase of your becoming. In traditional cultures, this void was honored as a necessary part of spiritual development. Vision quests, dark nights of the soul, initiation rites. All of these recognize that growth often requires a period of dissolution, of not knowing, of emptiness. But we live in a culture that pathologizes stillness, that medicates mystery, that tries to fix what might not be broken at all. Jung warned that if we try to skip this phase, if we rush back into action before the transformation is complete, we risk building a new life on the same old foundations. We might look different on the outside, but we'll be running the same unconscious programs that brought us to the need for shadow work in the first place. Here's the truth that changes everything. The silence is not a sign of collapse. It's a sacred pause before transformation. Every motivation you've ever had that was based on fear, on social expectations, on proving your worth, on avoiding pain, all of it is gone. Not because you're broken, but because you've outgrown it. Your soul is literally refusing to act again. Jung put it perfectly when he said, "You are not failing. You are in between." Think about what motivation used to mean to you. If you're honest, really honest, how much of your drive came from trying to earn love? How much came from fear of not being enough? How much was just sophisticated anxiety, wearing a productivity costume? When you do shadow work, when you truly integrate those unconscious patterns, you don't just heal the wounds. You stop believing that your worth depends on your performance. You stop believing that love has to be earned. You stop believing that you're only valuable when you're producing something. And when those beliefs die, so does the motivation they powered. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the death of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to fit into society, the character we perform to get our needs met. But it's not who we really are. It's who we think we need to be to survive. Shadow work strips away the persona. It reveals the difference between your authentic self and the self you've been performing. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. The problem is, most of your life was organized around that performed self. Your career, your relationships, your goals, your entire sense of purpose, all of it was designed to feed and maintain a version of you that you now recognize as incomplete at best, false at worst. So what happens when that version of you dies, but you haven't yet discovered who you really are underneath? You feel unmotivated, because motivation, real motivation, can only come from truth. And the truth is still emerging. Let me share another story. This one's about David, a successful architect who spent 3 years working through childhood trauma and attachment wounds. The healing process was profound. He felt more at peace than he ever had in his life. But when he tried to return to his work, designing buildings, managing projects, climbing the corporate ladder, he felt like he was wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore. Not uncomfortable exactly, just wrong. Like he was playing a character in a play he no longer believed in. "I used to be so driven," he told me. "I'd work 60-hour weeks and love it. I had 5-year plans, 10-year goals. I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly how to get it. Now I look at those same goals and feel nothing. It's like they belong to someone else." David thought he was depressed. He went to his doctor, considered medication, wondered if he needed more therapy. But what he was experiencing wasn't depression. It was the natural result of profound inner change. His old motivations, proving his worth through achievement, earning his father's approval through success, avoiding the shame of failure, were no longer available to him. Shadow work had healed those wounds, integrated those needs, resolved those fears. But his new motivations, the ones that would come from his authentic self rather than his wounded ego, hadn't emerged yet. This is the tipping point Jung talked about. The moment when you realize that true motivation, sustainable motivation, lasting motivation doesn't come from compulsion. It comes from truth. When you're motivated by fear, you can push through anything. Fear is an incredibly powerful fuel. It will get you up at 5 a.m., keep you working until midnight, drive you to achieve things you never thought possible. But fear-based motivation has an expiration date. Eventually, you either burn out or you heal enough to stop being afraid. And when the fear stops driving you, if you don't have anything else to take its place, you feel empty. That emptiness isn't the problem. It's the solution. It's your psyche, creating space for something new to emerge. If this part hits something in you, keep going. The next few minutes might feel like a mirror. Jung believed that the self, your deeper, more authentic essence, doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It doesn't create drama or urgency or crisis to get your attention. The self whispers, it nudges, it invites. But if your life is full of noise, if you're constantly driven by external pressures and internal fears, you can't hear the whisper, you can't feel the nudge, you can't sense the invitation. That's why the void is sacred. That's why the silence is necessary. That's why losing your old motivation isn't failure, it's preparation. Your soul is creating the conditions for you to hear what it's been trying to tell you all along. Here's what nobody tells you about the other side of this void, about what happens when you stop fighting the silence and start listening to what it's trying to teach you. When new motivation emerges, it feels completely different. It's not anxious, it's not urgent, it's not driven by what you lack or what you're trying to prove or what you're afraid of losing. It's quiet, it's steady, it's undeniable. It's like the difference between artificial light and sunlight. Both will help you see, but one nourishes while the other just illuminates. Jung called this the emergence of the self with a capital S. Not the ego self that needs validation, that hungers for external confirmation, that constantly compares and competes and calculates, but the deeper self that is already whole, already enough, already connected to something larger than your individual survival. When the self begins to motivate you, you don't hustle. You respond. You don't chase opportunities like a starving person grabbing at food. You recognize them like someone who knows they belong at the table. You don't force passion like you're trying to jumpstart a dead battery. You follow curiosity like you're following a thread that leads somewhere worth going. You don't create from emptiness, desperate to fill a void. You create from fullness because something inside you is so alive it has to express itself. let me tell you what this looked like for David. The architect I mentioned earlier, after almost a year of feeling unmotivated and questioning everything, of wondering if he'd somehow broken himself with all that therapy, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like a light switch being flipped or a revelation striking like lightning. It was like watching the sun rise. So gradual you almost don't notice it's happening until suddenly the world is full of light and you can't remember when the darkness ended. He started taking long walks without his phone, not as exercise, not as a productivity hack he'd read about, not as networking opportunities, just as walking, movement for the sake of moving, being outside for the sake of being outside. No agenda, no goal, no measurement of success or failure. During one of these walks, he noticed an old building that had been abandoned for years. He'd driven past it thousands of times without really seeing it. But that day, something about its bones, its structure, its potential, its sadness, its dignity despite being forgotten, something spoke to him in a way nothing had for months. Instead of dismissing the feeling or trying to turn it into a business opportunity, or analyzing why he was drawn to decay and abandonment, he just sat with it. He started visiting the building regularly. He began sketching, not architectural plans, not blueprints for renovation, but just impressions. What the building felt like, what it wanted to become, what story it was trying to tell. This wasn't driven by career goals or financial incentives. It wasn't motivated by proving his worth or impressing anyone or building his portfolio. It was motivated by something else entirely. By curiosity, by beauty, by a sense of rightness he couldn't explain but didn't need to, by the simple fact that this building had something to say and he had suddenly developed the capacity to listen. He spent weeks just drawing, just sitting, just being present with this structure that nobody else seemed to notice. And slowly, gently, without any force or urgency, an idea began to emerge. Not a business plan, not a strategic initiative, but a vision, a possibility, a what-if that felt more real than anything he'd worked on in years. Eventually, that curiosity led to conversations with the building's owner. Those conversations led to other conversations. Those conversations led to a unique restoration project unlike anything he'd done before. One that honored the building's history while creating space for new life. One that involved the community in unexpected ways. One that felt less like imposing his will on the structure and more like collaborating with its essence. That project led to a new direction in his career. One that felt aligned with who he was becoming, rather than who he had been. But here's the key insight. None of this would have happened if he had tried to force his old motivation to return. If he had pushed through the void, ignored the silence, and gone back to his old way of working, he would have missed the whisper entirely. He would have driven past that building for another 10 years without seeing it. He would have continued designing spaces that looked impressive but felt empty. He would have remained successful but soul-starved, productive but purposeless. The self doesn't roar. It hums. It doesn't demand attention. It offers invitations. It doesn't create urgency. It creates resonance. When you learn to hear that hum, when you learn to trust that gentle guidance, when you learn to recognize the difference between ego drive and self-magnetism, motivation stops being about conquering your resistance and starts being about following your resonance. You write because you have something to share, not because you need views or validation or proof that you're smart enough. You create because beauty is moving through you, not because you need to be seen as creative. You love because connection is your nature, not because you're afraid of being alone. You work because the work itself calls to you, not because you need to prove your worth through productivity. This is what Jung meant when he talked about living symbolically. Not living in fantasy or delusion or spiritual bypassing, but living in conscious connection to the deeper patterns, the meaningful coincidences, the synchronicities that reveal how your individual story fits into the larger story of existence, how your personal healing serves something bigger than your personal comfort. When you're motivated by the self rather than the ego, work becomes devotion rather than obligation. Relationships become conscious choice rather than unconscious need. Creativity becomes expression rather than performance. Rest becomes nourishment rather than laziness. Boundaries become self-care rather than selfishness. And here's the paradox that would have shocked your old self. This gentler motivation often accomplishes more than the frantic energy that came before, because it's sustainable, because it's aligned with who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be, because it's coming from fullness rather than emptiness, from love rather than fear, from truth rather than compulsion. There's a journaling prompt I want to offer you here. It's simple, but it might help you discern between ego motivation and self-motivation in your own life. It might help you recognize which voice is speaking when you feel called to action or when you don't. Take out a piece of paper and write down 3 things you feel you should be motivated about right now. Things you think you ought to want, ought to pursue, ought to care about. Then ask yourself, where does this should come from? Whose voice is that, really? Who would be disappointed if I didn't care about this? What am I afraid will happen if I let this go? What am I trying to prove by wanting this? Then write down 3 things you find yourself drawn to, even if they don't make logical sense. Things that spark curiosity or wonder or peace. Things that make you feel more alive, more present, more like yourself. Ask yourself, what would it feel like to follow this pull without needing to justify it? What would it feel like to trust this attraction without needing to understand it completely? The difference between those 2 lists might show you the difference between motivation that comes from fear and motivation that comes from truth, between drive that exhausts you and draw that nourishes you, between the voice of your wounded ego and the whisper of your authentic self. Sarah, the woman I mentioned earlier, discovered through this process that her fear-based motivation in marketing had been covering up a deep longing to work with children. Not because she thought she should, not because it would look good to others, not because it would solve her problems or prove her worth, but because something in her came alive when she was around kids. Something that had been buried under years of trying to be who she thought she was supposed to be. It took her 2 years to make the transition from marketing executive to elementary school teacher. 2 years of following curiosity rather than clarity, of trusting the process rather than controlling the outcome, of taking small steps toward what felt true rather than giant leaps toward what looked impressive. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her family worried about the pay cut. Her logical mind had a million objections, but her soul was singing again for the first time in decades. So here's what I want you to understand. You didn't lose your motivation. You just outgrew the reasons that once pushed you. This isn't a consolation prize. This isn't settling for less. This is graduating to a deeper level of living. This is your psyche refusing to let you settle for performance when authenticity is available. The silence you've been afraid of? That's where your true self has been waiting to speak. The emptiness you've been trying to fill, that space being created for something more real, more sustainable, more genuinely you than anything you've experienced before. Jung didn't promise this would be easy. He never said individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, would be comfortable or quick or simple. He knew it required walking through the valley of not knowing, the desert of not feeling, the void of not being sure of anything. But he also knew this: on the other side of that desert is an oasis, not the mirage. You've been chasing the perfect life, the perfect job, the perfect relationship, the perfect version of yourself. But something real, something that doesn't need to be perfect because it's true. The motivation that emerges from this place doesn't burn you out because it's not coming from deficit. It doesn't leave you empty because it's not taking more than it gives. It doesn't disappear when circumstances change because it's rooted in who you are, not what you want. If you're in the void right now, if you're feeling unmotivated and wondering what's wrong with you, I want you to consider this. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe something is very, very right. Maybe your soul is finally strong enough to stop performing. Maybe your psyche is finally integrated enough to tell the difference between authentic desire and inherited obligation. Maybe you're finally healed, enough to wait for real inspiration instead of running on manufactured urgency. Listen to the silence, not with your ears, but with your heart. What has it been trying to tell you? What has it been protecting you from? What has it been preparing you for? Your old life, the one driven by fear and need, and the endless hunger for external validation that life is over. You did the work to end it. You faced your shadow specifically, so you wouldn't have to live that way anymore. This isn't the end of your healing journey. This is the beginning of your authentic life. This is where the real adventure starts. The self you're becoming doesn't need motivation in the old sense. It needs recognition. It needs trust. It needs you to stop trying so hard to become someone else and start paying attention to who you already are. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are exactly where you need to be for the next phase of your becoming to begin. And when it does begin, when that quiet hum of authentic motivation starts to emerge, you'll understand why the silence was so necessary. You'll see why the void had to be emptied before it could be filled with something real. You'll realize that losing your old motivation wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a gift to be received. The gift of finally being free to discover what you're really here for. If this video resonated with something deep in you, if it helped you name what you've been experiencing, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Your story, your journey through this void might be exactly what someone else needs to hear, to know they're not alone. And if you want to continue exploring these deeper currents of psychology and soul, if you're drawn to understanding the hidden patterns that shape our inner lives, make sure to subscribe. Because this conversation about what it really means to become who we are, this conversation is just beginning. The void isn't the end of your story. It's the comma between the life you've been living and the life you're meant to live. And that life, it's worth the wait.